Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. Marianne had always believed that marriage was a garden that bloomed when watered with patience, kindness, and trust. In the beginning, her life with Thomas was indeed like a field after the rain, fresh and promising, full of laughter that spilled freely and dreams that seemed as wide as the sky above Enugu's hills. She remembered those days as though they belonged to a different world, when he would hold her hand at the market and buy her oranges with the playful insistence of a man showing off his treasure. Those gestures had once convinced her that her home would forever be a place of warmth. Yet the years crept by with invisible claws, scraping at the tenderness until it became something sharp and hostile. What began as disagreements over small matters grew into silences that could stretch like droughts. Love that once carried the fragrance of ripe mangoes turned sour, and she found herself living with a man whose voice no longer soothed but cut like the blade of a broken bottle. It was not sudden, this change. It was a slow unraveling, like a cloth eaten by termites, until one day she realized there was nothing left of the man she married except the shell of his body and the bitterness in his tongue. Still, Marianne endured. She told herself again and again that love was not a flower to be plucked when it wilted, but a seed to be watered until it bloomed again. But patience is a candle. When it burns too long, even the wax loses strength. She began to feel like a guest in her own house, walking carefully, breathing quietly, afraid that any word from her lips could ignite anger. Each night, she lay in bed beside him, staring at the ceiling as his back turned to hers, wondering if the man she had married was buried under layers of resentment or if he had been swallowed whole by time. The neighbors would see them walk together sometimes and assume all was well, but she carried her sorrow in silence, wearing it like a cloth no one else could see. Thomas, who once lit fires in her heart with kindness, now sparked only arguments that ended with doors slammed and voices raised. The woman who once felt like a bride in a story now felt like a servant chained to a life that mocked her loyalty. It was on one of those nights, when the house seemed to breathe with shadows, that she realized love can die not with thunder but with silence. On that fateful evening when everything unraveled completely, the quarrel started over something so small it could have been mistaken for nothing at all. Marianne had returned from the market later than usual, the bags heavy with yams, tomatoes, and the bitter leaf she planned to cook into soup. The sun was already sinking into the horizon, painting the sky with bruises of purple and orange, and she was tired from bargaining and walking. Yet, instead of a word of concern, Thomas greeted her with accusations, his voice rising like the tide against rocks. He accused her of wasting time, of being careless with his money, of not knowing her place. Each word struck her like stones thrown by an angry mob, yet she held her tongue, hoping silence would cool the fire. But silence, in that house, had become fuel. His anger grew sharper, his eyes wild with frustration, as though every disappointment in his life was pinned to her existence. She tried to explain, her voice trembling like a candle flame in the wind, but he would not hear her. In the heat of it all, she turned toward the door, her mind whispering escape, her heart begging for air. But Thomas, not willing to lose his stage of power, chased after her into the small courtyard, the evening air thick with tension. What happened next burned into her memory with cruel clarity. He dug into his pocket, pulled out a crumpled $20 bill, and hurled it at her with a sneer. "Take it," he spat, his voice laced with venom. "That's all you're worth." The note fluttered like a wounded bird before landing near her feet. For a moment the world stopped. She looked at him, at the man she once called her joy, and saw nothing but scorn staring back. Slowly, as though bending under the weight of invisible chains, she crouched, picked up the money, and held it in her hand. She did not speak, for words had abandoned her. She simply turned and walked away, her steps heavy, her heart splintered, her silence louder than any scream. As she left the compound, the streets of Enugu greeted her with their indifferent hum, the rickety motorcycles weaving through the dust, the hawkers calling out their wares with voices stronger than her own spirit at that moment. She walked without direction, her mind a whirlpool of memories, her chest carrying the ache of betrayal. Each step felt like walking on shards of glass, yet she moved forward, clutching the $20 bill as though it were both curse and proof of her existence. The insult clung to her skin like the dampness of harmattan mornings. She thought of her mother's words long ago, that marriage was like a pot of soup, sometimes sweet, sometimes bitter, but always a meal to be shared. Yet here she was, tasting bitterness alone, left with nothing but a torn note and a hollow chest. The world around her carried on. Children laughed near roadside kiosks. A woman argued over the price of fish. Men gathered by beer parlors speaking of politics and football. Life continued, mocking her pain, reminding her that her heartbreak was only hers to carry. Her thoughts drifted back to the years she had given, the laughter she had once known, the promises that had dried up like a riverbed in dry season. Was this what her loyalty had earned her? Was this the prize for endurance? The $20 bill seemed to burn hotter in her palm, each crease a scar etched into her soul. She could not bring herself to throw it away, though every instinct screamed at her to let it fall into the gutter. It was as though some unseen force bound her to it, whispering that its story was not yet complete. And so she walked and walked, past the buzzing lights, past the faces that turned but did not see, until the night swallowed her figure and left only the echo of her steps. When at last she stopped, she found herself before a small building glowing with neon colors, laughter spilling from its doors like wine from an overturned cup. It was a lottery kiosk, a place she had never given thought to before. Men stood around in clusters, tickets in hand, their faces lit with either hope or disappointment. The noise inside was thick, but Marianne felt no fear. She stepped closer, the $20 bill still clenched in her fist, its edges damp from the sweat of her palm. She did not know why she was drawn there. Perhaps it was numbness, perhaps a strange pull from fate, or perhaps the human need to place pain into the hands of chance when there seems nowhere else to turn. She walked in, her eyes scanning the bright posters, the counter lined with slips of numbers. The attendant looked at her without curiosity, just another customer. Marianne stared at the $20 note one last time, her chest heavy with the memory of how it had landed at her feet like discarded trash. Then, with a sigh that carried the weight of all her broken years, she placed it on the counter. "Give me a ticket," she said quietly. Her voice was steady, though her heart thundered like a drum in the silence of her soul. The attendant slid a ticket across to her, and she took it with fingers that trembled not with hope, but with the exhaustion of a woman who had given everything and been left with nothing. She folded it, tucked it into her purse, and stepped back into the night, unaware that the insult she carried had just sown the seed of her destiny. Marianne walked as though the road had no end, her feet dragging across Enugu's dusty paths while the night wrapped around her like a heavy shawl. The voices of vendors still selling roasted corn floated into the air. Children played football with plastic bags knotted into a ball, and the distant honk of buses reminded her that the city was alive even though her spirit felt dead. The lottery ticket in her bag sat like an unfamiliar guest, its presence both meaningless and yet strangely important, though she did not fully understand why. She touched the bag occasionally, her fingers brushing against it as if confirming that it still existed, but her heart could not summon any hope. All she felt was exhaustion, the kind that lives in the bones and makes even breathing an effort. She thought of Thomas, of the face that once glowed with affection when he first courted her, and she wondered how love could change so completely. It was like planting cassava and harvesting thorns. She could not decide whether time had stolen him from her, or whether he had simply shed his skin to reveal who he always was. Her mind wrestled with the memories of good days, of laughter that had once filled the small compound, but they felt like distant echoes mocking her present sorrow. A passerby asked her for the time, but she could not even find her voice to answer. She kept moving, step after step, as if her feet knew the way though her heart was lost. A stray dog barked near the gutter, startling her, and she paused, realizing she had been walking for hours without direction. The streetlights flickered, casting shadows that seemed to follow her like silent witnesses to her pain. She leaned against a wall, the rough cement scratching her shoulder, and allowed her body to sag under the weight of her grief. She whispered to herself, "How did I get here?" But the night gave no reply. She could still feel the sting of the $20 bill in her palm, as though the insult carried its own heat that would not leave her skin. She was not crying anymore. Her tears had dried, leaving her eyes swollen and sore. She only felt hollow, like a drum that had been beaten too many times until its sound was gone. She thought of her childhood in Succa, when life was simpler, when her father's laughter filled the evenings and her mother sang while grinding pepper on a stone. Back then, she believed the world was kind, that hard work and goodness always bore sweet fruit. She carried that belief into her marriage, tending to it carefully like a small flame in the wind. Yet the flame had been snuffed out, not by storms but by the slow suffocation of neglect. Her life with Thomas had become like yam left too long in the barn, once full of promise, but now rotting from the inside. As she walked, the smell of suya roasting at a nearby stand reminded her of evenings long ago when Thomas would buy her skewers wrapped in newspaper, his eyes shining with the eagerness of a man in love. How strange that the same man had now reduced her worth to a crumpled note tossed at her feet. She realized then that betrayal does not always come from strangers. Sometimes it comes from the very hands that once stroked your face, from the very lips that once whispered devotion. She could feel her chest tightening as she tried to reconcile the man she married with the man who humiliated her. Life felt like a cruel play, and she was trapped in a role she never auditioned for. She found herself speaking softly to the night, confessing fears she could never share with anyone. "If love can die like this, what is left for me?" she asked. Her voice was swallowed by the air, but speaking it out made her feel lighter, even if only by a grain. The streets were quieter now, the shops closing, the noise dying down. Somewhere, a radio played high-life music, its melody floating gently, reminding her that life had rhythms that continued no matter how broken one heart might be. She closed her eyes and allowed herself to sway slightly, as though the music was guiding her forward. She realized she had to keep moving, not because she knew where she was going, but because standing still felt like drowning. Eventually, her steps carried her back to the small lodge she had rented earlier that week to give herself breathing space from Thomas. It was a modest room, its bed sagging, the walls stained with years of use, but it was hers, even if only for a while. She unlocked the door and entered, shutting out the noise of the city. She sat on the bed, her body sinking into the mattress, as though the weight of her sorrow demanded a softer ground. The room was dim, lit only by a single bulb that flickered like a hesitant heartbeat. She reached into her bag and pulled out the lottery ticket, staring at it as if it could explain why she had chosen to buy it. She had never played such games before, never even considered gambling, but that night something had pushed her hand. She ran her fingers over the numbers, her eyes unfocused, her thoughts adrift. She remembered the way the $20 note had landed at her feet, the cruel smirk on Thomas's face, and she shivered. She folded the ticket carefully, as though it were fragile, and slipped it under her pillow. She whispered, "If fate wants to mock me, let it mock me fully," and lay back on the bed. Sleep did not come easily. She tossed and turned, haunted by memories, by anger, by the sharp echo of Thomas's voice. Yet, in the stillness, there was also something else, an unfamiliar calm, like the hush before rainfall. She could not name it, but it was there, nestled beneath her pain, like a seed hidden in the soil. The night stretched on endlessly, but at some point exhaustion claimed her, and she drifted into sleep. Dreams came, disjointed and strange. She dreamt of rivers overflowing their banks, of fireflies lighting up dark forests, of herself standing at a crossroad with no signs to guide her. She woke several times, her chest pounding, before finally falling into a deep slumber that lasted until the rooster's crow pierced the morning air. She sat up slowly, her eyes heavy, her body stiff from unrest. The small room looked the same, but the world outside had changed. She could hear voices in the corridor, neighbors talking excitedly, their words spilling through the thin walls. They spoke of numbers, of winnings, of fortune that had landed unexpectedly in the city. She frowned, confusion clouding her mind, until her hand instinctively reached beneath her pillow and found the lottery ticket. Her breath caught in her throat. She pulled it out, her heart suddenly pounding, and stared at it with wide eyes. Something inside her whispered that her story was not finished, that the crumpled bill Thomas threw at her feet was not the end, but the beginning of a path she had never imagined. Marianne's fingers trembled as she held the lottery ticket in the pale light of dawn, her pulse quickening with each passing second. She had not planned for this moment, had not even imagined it in her wildest dreams, yet here she was, sitting on the edge of a sagging mattress in a small rented room, staring at numbers that might alter the course of her life. She could hear the neighbors outside, their excitement like the buzzing of bees when honey has been found, each voice louder than the last, talking of fortune, of miracles, of winnings that seemed too grand to belong in a place as ordinary as their street in Enugu. She unfolded the ticket carefully, her hands damp with sweat, and began comparing the digits against the winning numbers whispered through the thin walls. One matched, then another. Her breath shortened, and her vision blurred. By the time she reached the final number, her body was trembling violently, her heart drumming against her ribs like a talking drum struck with urgency. All the numbers matched. Every single one. She had won. The $20 bill that Thomas had thrown at her feet with contempt had transformed into a river of fortune. For a long time, she could not move. She sat there frozen, the ticket pressed against her chest, her thoughts refusing to settle. She wanted to scream, to laugh, to cry, but instead only silence escaped her lips. Her body shook, her breath came in shallow bursts, and her mind asked the same question over and over. Is this real? The room felt too small for the enormity of the moment, its cracked walls unable to contain the storm of emotions raging inside her. She pressed the ticket harder against her chest, as though to merge it with her heart, afraid it would vanish if she loosened her grip. The same note that had once marked her humiliation was now the root of her redemption, yet the weight of it did not bring joy immediately. Instead, it brought fear, the kind that seeps into your bones when life shifts suddenly, leaving you uncertain if you are standing on solid ground or thin ice. She rose slowly and moved to the window, peering out at the street as though the world had suddenly become foreign. The vendors were setting up their wares. Women balanced trays of akara on their heads while calling out to early customers. Children in uniforms hurried off to school, and a man with a wheelbarrow full of oranges shouted prices in a booming voice. Life outside continued as it always had, yet Marianne stood there with a secret so immense it seemed it should change the color of the sky. She wondered if the world would notice the shift within her, if the earth would tremble or the wind would whisper congratulations. But nothing happened. The sun continued to climb, indifferent to her new fortune, and the city carried on with its daily rhythm. She closed her eyes and thought of Thomas, of the look on his face when he tossed that $20 note at her, as though dismissing her from his life entirely. A bitter smile curved her lips. Could he ever imagine that the very note he used to belittle her would become her crown? Yet even in her triumph, Marianne felt no rush of vengeance. Her heart was too tired for that. Instead, she felt the slow dawning of possibility, a realization that her life might no longer be defined by sorrow and humiliation. Still, she dared not speak of her winnings. Secrets in Enugu traveled like harmattan dust, seeping through cracks and covering everything. She knew that if the news spread, strangers and kin alike would appear at her door with hands outstretched, each claiming a share of her fortune. For now, the ticket was her secret, folded neatly and tucked away like a delicate bird whose wings must not be disturbed until it was ready to fly. The day stretched on, each hour pulling at her nerves. She tried to eat, but found no appetite. She tried to lie down, but sleep refused her. Instead, she paced the small room, each step echoing in her ears like the toll of a distant bell. She thought about her future, about the roads that now opened before her, and felt both exhilaration and dread. The fortune promised freedom, but freedom was its own burden. Where would she go? What would she do? Could she build a new life from the ashes of the old one, or would the weight of her past still chain her? She remembered stories her grandmother once told her by the fireside in Sukka, of people who stumbled upon wealth only to be devoured by it, their lives ruined because they could not carry riches with wisdom. The memory made her clutch her chest and whisper a prayer, asking for strength to walk this new path without losing herself. She thought again of Thomas. Would he come looking for her once he heard whispers of her winnings? The thought tightened her stomach, not with fear, but with the knowledge that he would surely see her fortune as his own. She sat at the edge of her bed, pressing her palms together, whispering to herself that the money was not a curse but a second chance. Still, she could not shake the unease that came with such sudden change. She rose again, opened her bag, and checked the ticket as if afraid it might vanish. There it was, real and tangible, her future inked in numbers. She folded it carefully, tucked it back into her bag, and sat in silence, listening to the sounds of the city rising and falling like waves against a distant shore. That night, she could not resist walking outside, her steps carrying her through the lively streets of Enugu, as if she were searching for proof that life was truly as ordinary as it appeared. She passed by men clustered around tables playing draughts, their laughter loud and unguarded. Women sat in front of kerosene lamps, fanning the smoke from their fires as they roasted plantains for sale. The smell of fried bean cakes, pepper soup, and palm oil mixed in the air, wrapping her senses in familiarity. She moved through it all like a ghost, unseen and unknown, carrying her secret beneath her skin. She stopped at a small stall and bought roasted corn, handing the vendor a few naira notes, her fingers trembling slightly. The woman smiled at her warmly, and for a moment, Marianne felt grounded, reminded that even with her fortune, she was still a part of this world, still a woman who could stand in the crowd and share in the simple act of eating roasted corn on a noisy street. She ate slowly, the kernels crunching under her teeth, the smoky flavor lingering on her tongue, and she realized how fragile life was. Only hours ago, she had been nothing but a broken wife holding an insult in her palm. Now she carried a fortune that could change everything. She wiped her fingers, whispered a thank you to the vendor, and continued walking. The streets glowed with life, but within her chest was a storm she had not yet named. She returned to her room much later, lying on the bed with the ticket under her pillow once more. As she closed her eyes, she thought not of the money, not of the luxury it could bring, but of freedom, the possibility of waking each morning without fear, without humiliation, without Thomas's shadow hanging over her. It was that dream, not wealth, that finally lulled her to sleep. Thomas heard of the lottery when long before Marianne realized her silence could not shield her secret forever. In Enugu, nothing stayed hidden. Whispers traveled through beer parlors, across market stalls, and in the mouths of neighbors who carried news faster than the radio. At first, it was just a rumor, a story passed with disbelief. Someone in the city had struck wealth from a ticket bought with the kind of money that most people would waste on roasted groundnuts or cigarettes. But as days stretched into a week, and the gossip sharpened with details, Thomas began to listen more closely. He had been sitting outside a local bar, drinking palm wine with his friends, when a man mentioned that the lucky winner was a woman who lived not far from the center of the town. Another added that she was quiet, withdrawn, and had been seen walking alone in the evenings. Something in the description tugged at Thomas's mind like a thorn caught in cloth. The more he listened, the more his suspicion grew, until the truth settled over him like a heavy cloak. Marianne, the wife he had scorned and dismissed with a crumpled bill, had been the one fortune had chosen. The thought sent a strange mix of feelings through him. At first there was disbelief, then a flash of pride, as though her success reflected on him somehow, and finally a gnawing hunger, sharp and insistent. He had been living carelessly, with debts chasing him from one end of the city to the other, his nights filled with drink and regret. Now suddenly he saw a door opening before him, a chance to reclaim not only wealth but the power he once held over Marianne. He wiped his mouth, set down his calabash, and muttered to himself, "She cannot eat that alone. After all, was it not my money that bought the ticket?" That night, Thomas did not sleep. He paced his small room, rehearsing words that tasted strange on his tongue, words of softness, of apology, of reunion. He knew he would have to wear a mask, for Marianne would not welcome him back with open arms. But a man does not allow gold to slip through his fingers when it is within reach. When Thomas finally appeared at Marianne's door, he carried himself with an air of forced gentleness, his face stretched into a smile that felt unnatural even to him. Marianne had been expecting something like this. She had noticed the way neighbors now greeted her with curious eyes, the subtle changes in their tone, the way they lingered near her as though waiting for her to confess the truth. So when she opened the door and saw Thomas standing there, his eyes suddenly soft where once they had been sharp with anger, she did not gasp. Instead, she simply looked at him, her silence forming a wall he could not easily climb. "Mary," he began, his voice thick with rehearsed warmth, "I have missed you. I know I have made mistakes, but the heart always longs for home. Let us forget what has passed." The words floated in the air like feathers too light to hold meaning. Marianne studied him, her eyes searching his face, but she found no sincerity there, only hunger, carefully disguised. He reached for her hand, but she pulled it back, folding her arms across her chest. He continued, his voice growing more desperate as he spoke of love, of family, of togetherness. It was only when his words began to falter that his true desire emerged. "Mary, you know without me, you wouldn't have had that ticket. That $20, it was mine. It is only right that we share this blessing. I don't ask for everything, just my fair share. 75% for me, 25% for you. That is fair, is it not?" His eyes gleamed as though he had already pocketed the fortune. Marianne did not flinch. She let his words sink into the room like the smell of kerosene, sharp and suffocating. Her silence was not weakness. It was a storm gathering behind calm clouds. For a long moment, the room was filled only with the hum of a distant generator, the muffled shouts of children playing outside, and the sound of Thomas's own breathing, heavy and uneven. Marianne finally spoke, her voice calm, almost gentle, but her words carrying the weight of years. "You are right, Thomas. Without you, I would not have had that money. But tell me, without me, would you have had a wife who stayed even after love had died? Would you have had a woman who cooked for you, prayed for you, carried your burdens while you buried her in silence?" Her words did not rise in anger, yet they struck like stones hurled into still water, each one sending ripples through his pride. Thomas shifted uncomfortably, his smile breaking, his mask slipping. She continued, her eyes steady, her tone like iron beneath silk. You gave me $20 not out of love, but out of scorn. You threw it at me as though I were nothing. And now, because fortune chose to turn insult into blessing, you come to claim it as your own. Tell me, Thomas, do you truly believe you have earned it? Thomas tried to protest, to reach again for his argument, but the words stumbled from his lips, weak and hollow. He was not prepared for her firmness, for the woman before him who no longer carried the shadow of fear in her eyes. Marian did not raise her voice, but each syllable fell with the certainty of a hammer striking a nail. In that moment, Thomas realized the Marianne he had once controlled with silence and shame had slipped from his grasp, and what remained was a woman no longer bound by his power. Thomas left her room that evening with his chest burning, his mind a battlefield of greed and wounded pride. He had expected her to bend, to welcome him with open arms, to be softened by his sudden affection. Instead, he found himself standing in the street, staring at her closed door, feeling as though the ground had shifted beneath his feet. He clenched his fists, swore under his breath, and told himself that the battle was not yet over. If he could not win her with words, he would find another way. He would not allow her to walk freely with wealth he believed was his by right. As he walked away, his steps quick and uneven, he replayed her words in his mind, each one stinging like a whip. She had looked at him not with fear, not even with anger, but with a calm that unnerved him, a calm that told him she no longer saw him as the master of her fate. That realization wounded him more than poverty ever could. Marianne, on the other hand, closed her door quietly, leaned against it, and let out a breath she had been holding for years. For the first time since Thomas had hurled that note at her feet, she felt the weight lifting from her chest. The battle was not finished. She knew he would return, that greed would not allow him to rest. But in that moment, she felt a strength she had long forgotten. She pressed her hand against her heart, whispered a prayer of gratitude, and told herself that no matter what came next, she would no longer be the woman who bent beneath his scorn. She had found her voice, and no amount of pleading or threats could silence it again. Marian sat alone in her small room after Thomas had left, the echoes of his voice still clinging to the air like smoke that refused to clear. She had faced him without trembling, had spoken her truth without faltering, but the encounter left her drained, as though she had run a long distance carrying a heavy load on her back. She lit a small lamp, its soft glow stretching across the cracked wall, and allowed herself to sink onto the bed. The silence was thick, yet within it she felt a strange calm, like the steady rhythm of waves brushing against the shore after a storm. For years, she had carried his scorn in her heart like stones in a basket, each insult weighing her down until she forgot the sound of her own laughter. But now, with the fortune hidden in her possession, and the strength of her own words rising in her chest, she felt lighter, freer, as though she had been standing under rain for years, and only now stepped into the sun. Still, she knew this was not the end. Thomas was not a man who let go easily. His pride would not allow him to accept defeat. She pictured him walking the streets with clenched fists, muttering to himself, plotting his return. The thought sent a chill through her, yet it did not break her. She reminded herself that strength is not the absence of fear, but the decision to walk forward, even while fear whispers at your back. She touched the lottery ticket tucked safely away, and for the first time she smiled, a small, fragile smile, but real. She whispered into the dim room, "This is not just money. This is my freedom." The following days stretched like taut strings, each one vibrating with both tension and resolve. Marianne carried herself differently now. She no longer walked through the streets with her shoulders bowed and her eyes lowered. Instead, she moved with quiet dignity, her steps firm, her gaze steady, as though she had discovered a secret rhythm in life that others could not hear. Neighbors noticed the change but could not name it, and though whispers of her fortune lingered in the air, she said nothing. She greeted those she met with a calm smile, neither confirming nor denying the rumors. It was as though she had built a house of silence around herself, a fortress no gossip could penetrate. Inside, however, her thoughts churned. She thought about the years wasted at Thomas's side, the nights she had prayed for his love to return, the mornings she had forced herself to cook and clean despite the emptiness in her heart. All that pain had not vanished. It still lived within her, but now it served as a reminder, a warning that she must never again hand her life into the careless hands of another. She thought of her grandmother's proverb, "The one who has been burnt by soup blows even cold yam before eating." She understood it now. She had been burned, but she would not let it happen again. She made quiet plans, scribbling notes to herself about where she might go, what she might do, how she could use her winnings to build a future where no one's voice could silence hers. The thought of starting anew frightened her, but it also thrilled her, like standing at the edge of a vast river and knowing you must cross even if the waters roar. One evening, Thomas returned again, his face stripped of the false sweetness he had worn before. His eyes were sharp, his voice hard, and his words laced with accusation. He demanded, pleaded, threatened in turn, shifting like a man drowning who would grasp at anything within reach. Marianne listened quietly, her expression calm, her silence unsettling him more than anger ever could. When he accused her of betrayal, she simply looked at him. When he shouted that she owed him everything, she did not flinch. Her stillness was a mirror, forcing him to see himself clearly, and he could not bear the reflection. At last, when his voice grew hoarse and his threats turned to muttered curses, she spoke. Her words were measured, her tone steady, each syllable deliberate. "Thomas, you cannot take from me what you never gave. I gave you my years, my loyalty, my strength. You gave me insults. That is the truth we both know." Her voice did not rise, but it carried a power that filled the room, a power born not of anger but of certainty. Thomas faltered, his shoulders sagging as though the weight of her words pressed upon him. He spat on the ground, muttered something under his breath, and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Marianne remained where she was, her hands folded in her lap, her heart steady. For the first time in her life, she felt she had faced him not as a wife silenced by duty, but as a woman standing firmly on her own ground. After he left, she sat by the window, watching the night stretch itself across the sky like a vast cloth woven with stars. The city below hummed with its usual noises, motorcycles buzzing like restless insects, vendors calling out their wares, children laughing in bursts before being called indoors. Marian leaned her head against the window frame and allowed herself to breathe deeply, her chest rising and falling with a rhythm that felt like peace. She knew the road ahead would not be simple. Thomas might return again, might bring others into his schemes, might try to shame her in the eyes of the community. But she also knew she was no longer the woman who had bent down to pick up an insult from the ground. That Marianne had been broken. This Marianne was rising from the pieces. She whispered to herself, "Even if he returns with storms, I will not drown. I have found the shore." She closed the window, drew the curtain, and prepared to rest, her heart lighter than it had been in years. The ticket under her pillow was not just a symbol of wealth. It was a reminder of her resilience, of the strange ways fate could turn ashes into fire, pain into power. She lay down and closed her eyes, and for the first time in a very long while, she fell into sleep not from exhaustion or sorrow but from the quiet strength of a woman who had chosen herself. The days that followed felt like standing at the edge of two worlds, one she had left behind, and one she was still learning to enter. Marianne woke each morning in her small room, the sound of the city stirring outside her window, the cries of hawkers blending with the honks of impatient drivers, and the laughter of children running to school. Yet beneath those familiar sounds was an unfamiliar peace, like a stream running quietly beneath stones. She was no longer burdened by Thomas's voice, no longer forced to walk on eggshells in her own home. She could breathe freely now, though she knew that his shadow still hovered somewhere near, restless and unwilling to let her go. She often sat at her window with the lottery ticket in her hand, running her fingers over the numbers, as if they were a secret language only she could read. It did not feel like wealth yet. It felt like a promise, a doorway waiting to be opened, but one she approached slowly, carefully, for she knew that sudden riches could devour just as surely as hunger. She remembered her grandmother's words, that blessings are like oil. If handled carelessly, they slip through your fingers and vanish. So she planned quietly. She thought of the river towns beyond Enugu, where life moved at a gentler pace, where no one knew her story, where she could begin again. She dreamed of a small house with open windows, a garden where she could plant cassava and peppers, a place where laughter did not sound like betrayal. The dream was fragile but steady, a flame she guarded carefully in her heart. Yet as she dreamed, she also prepared, for she knew Thomas would not give up so easily. Men like him did not surrender. They clung to their pride and their hunger until both consumed them. She was not wrong. Within days, Thomas returned, but this time he came with fire in his eyes and anger on his tongue. The mask of gentleness was gone, replaced by the raw fury of a man who believed he had been robbed of his right. He shouted at her door, his voice echoing down the corridor, drawing neighbors from their rooms to watch the scene unfold. He accused her of witchcraft, of betrayal, of stealing what belonged to him. His words were sharp, flung like stones meant to bruise her in the sight of others. Marianne opened the door slowly, her face calm, her eyes steady, and stood before him with the quiet dignity of a queen. She did not shout back, did not let anger spill from her lips. Instead, she spoke with a firmness that silenced even the murmuring crowd. "Thomas," she said, her voice carrying over his rage, "you cannot take what you did not value. You gave me money not as a gift, but as an insult. You threw it at me as though I were nothing. But fate has turned it into my freedom, not yours. And I will not let you chain me again." The crowd murmured, some nodding, some whispering, but Thomas's face twisted with shame and fury. He lunged forward as if to push past her, but Marianne stood her ground. Two men from the crowd stepped in, pulling him back, muttering that a man should not disgrace himself further. Humiliated, Thomas spat on the ground and stormed off, his pride in tatters, his threats hanging in the air like smoke after fire. Marianne closed the door behind her, her hands shaking slightly, but her heart steady. She knew now that she had won, not just against his greed, but against the years he had tried to silence her spirit. That night, Marianne packed her belongings quietly. She did not take much, only the clothes she needed, a few keepsakes, and the folded ticket that had become her key. She moved slowly, deliberately, as though savoring each moment of departure. The room had been her shelter, a place where she had found herself again, but she knew it was only a stepping stone. She left before dawn, slipping into the waking city as the first light painted the sky. The streets were cool, the air carrying the faint scent of roasted groundnuts from an early vendor. She walked with her head high, her steps steady, her heart lighter than it had been in years. She boarded a bus heading toward the river town she had dreamed of, her eyes watching the city fade behind her. The journey was long, the road winding through hills and villages, but each mile felt like a shedding of old skin. She thought of Thomas, of the life she had endured, and felt no bitterness now, only relief. She whispered a quiet prayer, not for him to fail, but for herself to never again forget her worth. The bus rattled on, the passengers around her chatting, laughing or dozing, but she remained quiet, her hands folded in her lap, her mind painting images of the new life awaiting her. When the bus finally reached the river town, she stepped off and breathed deeply, the fresh scent of water filling her lungs. It felt like stepping into a story she had been waiting her whole life to enter. In the days that followed, Marianne began to build her life with patience, each step careful, each decision deliberate. She found a small house near the river, its windows open to the breeze, its yard wide enough for a garden. She planted peppers, cassava, and okra, her hands working the soil with the same tenderness she had once poured into her marriage, but this time for herself alone. She kept her fortune hidden, using it sparingly, investing quietly, never boasting, never drawing attention. She lived simply, yet with a joy that grew steadily like the plants in her garden. Sometimes, in the evenings, she would sit by the riverbank and watch the water flow endlessly, carrying away leaves and branches, reminding her of the way life moves on, no matter the storms it carries. She thought of Thomas less and less, his shadow fading with each passing day, until he became nothing more than a memory, like a wound that had healed, leaving only a faint scar. She smiled often now, a soft, genuine smile, the kind that comes not from wealth but from peace. The $20 bill that had once been thrown at her as an insult was no longer just paper or memory. It had become a symbol of her journey, of her strength, of the strange ways life can turn cruelty into redemption. And though she never spoke of it to anyone, she carried it always in her heart, a reminder that even in the darkest nights, fate sometimes leaves a hidden lamp waiting to be lit. Life has a way of surprising us. Sometimes, those who look down on you may unknowingly hand you the very tool that lifts you higher. Do not let the insults or rejection of others define you. Instead, let them remind you of your strength and of the hidden treasures life can bring. Remember, every storm passes, and often, it washes the ground clean for new seeds to grow. Hold on to your dignity, protect your peace, and never forget that your value is far greater than how others choose to treat you. May every insult in your life be turned into honor. May every stone thrown at you become a stepping stone to your greatness. May you never be at the mercy of those who despise you. Where you have been mocked, may you be celebrated. Where doors have been slammed against you, may new and better doors open wide. May peace clothe your heart, may joy fill your days, and may blessings follow you like a faithful shadow wherever you go. And may the hands that rise against you find no power over your destiny. So shall it be, in your life and in mine, in Jesus' name. Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.